この効率性を上げるためにできるだけターゲットを絞っていきたいというふうに思っています。
En este mundo globalizado tenemos la oportunidad de
Despite globalization, it is still possible to avoid policy conflicts between countries. I would like to insist on this point, but be clear, however, that there is no single global model applicable to everyone, and it is important to find different models that can work in harmony, but that respond to varying social needs. Governments have an obligation to respond to societal aspirations and try to design specific policies that can address these aspirations.
Las aspiraciones sociales, implementar políticas para darles satisfacción.
As the overwhelming share of the world's poor live in rural areas, improving conditions in global agriculture can make a major contribution towards achieving the goal of eradicating extreme poverty and hunger.
If I talk about global justice, everything we are doing has to answer the question, is it good for global justice? If you look at the Millennium Development Goals of the FAO, we see there are 850 million people which are very poor and which are very hungry. And if we create a new policy for agriculture, for international trade, we have to answer the question, is it good for global justice or not?
Policies which perform best domestically also tend to distort trade the least. Opening up markets and reducing trade-distorting subsidies in the process of multilateral trade liberalization, therefore, does not undermine countries' ability to achieve their domestic aims in agriculture.
There's no question that when tariffs are reduced, it increases certainly competition in the domestic market. And this in turn then forces domestic industry, agricultural, non-agricultural, to try and achieve productivity gains, efficiencies and so forth, to better compete with imported products. So at the end of the day, the domestic industry is stronger.
The common aim of all countries in pursuing their domestic interests is to avoid depressing global markets and imposing unfair burdens on producers in other countries.
Nous avons également, en matière de politique internationale, d'échange.
In terms of international trade policy, we have two key issues. The first is solidarity. That is, solidarity as expressed through the trade preferences we offer to the poorest, least developed importing African, Caribbean and Pacific countries. But secondly, we have a long history of exports and do not suggest we are angels in this regard. We want to be realistic and compete on equal terms with our major trade competitors.
Improving market access globally in parallel with reducing trade distortions from export competition measures remain a priority for international policy reform in agriculture, and that non-tariff barriers must not be used to replace tariffs.
If there's one message I've wanted to leave with my colleagues here at the meeting, it's that we mustn't neglect the trade side of the reform process. A lot has been done, especially in Europe, to reform the way agricultural support is delivered. But really, we haven't made very much progress at all on the trade side, on the market access side of the Doha negotiations. And all the OECD work tells us this is fundamentally important if we're going to have real reform.
While policy and trade reform yield global welfare gains, there are winners and losers. trade liberalization needs to be accompanied by well-targeted national and multilateral assistance mechanisms and domestic reforms to ensure that all nations benefit from the progressive opening of agricultural markets.
We think that agricultural policy reform has an enormous contribution to make to the alleviation of poverty and the promotion of growth worldwide. Of course, agricultural reform involves losers in the short term as well as winners, and it's very important to take these into account and to help the adjustment process. But the fact that there are losers in change is no reason for opposing change.
For developing countries to benefit from trade and growth potential provided by more open markets, there is a need for development assistance and trade capacity building, including through well-targeted technical assistance.
I was very glad to hear that almost all who spoke on behalf of OECD countries emphasized that solidarity is a major policy objective for them. And what that means, of course, is ensure that those who lose as a result of trade liberalization or any other policy measures in OECD countries would need assistance in adapting to that new situation.
Delegates welcome OECD efforts to continue to reach and engage less developed economies with a view to improving not just the performance of national policies, but also the functioning of global agricultural markets.
We were very pleased to work with OECD. Their report provides us a better understanding about our policies, and the discussion will help us to fit better policies in order to increase our competitiveness in the agribusiness world.
As we look at agricultural reform and trade liberalization, we see the opportunity for economic growth coming from reforms that lead us in a market-oriented path, and that's one that we hope will lead to job opportunities and economic growth in rural areas, which we're all interested in pursuing.
I think it was important to bring together the OECD members with 4 emerging countries. This is something new and a new experience, and it was a successful one. The main outcomes of our discussions were how important it is to look at the domestic policy, to make domestic policy at least less trade distorting, and in this respect decoupling plays an important role.